only takes into account the cutting part and not all the ligature and like tying stuff back together, which is what takes the longest. So when they tell you, it's say, it took 3 minutes, that's just the cutting part. And the estimation is between 15 and 20 minutes, which is still, quite fast to cut a leg off. But it's must be quite long for someone who is being operated on.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Resurrectionist Podcast. This week, we are joined by Dr. Nebiha Guiga. They have studied history at the School for Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences at the University of Heidelberg. They have a PhD on the treatment of wounded soldiers during the Napoleonic Wars and are currently undertaking a postdoctoral research at the Austrian Academy of Sciences. This week, we will be discussing their PhD topic, the treatment of wounded soldiers during the Napoleonic Wars. So welcome to the show, Dr. Guiga.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So your research has been on the treatment of wounded soldiers during the Napoleonic Wars, which is very interesting to me personally. And I'm sure my audience will also find it interesting, but I personally find it interesting, and that's all that matters because this is my show. So can you tell us what drew you to the history of medicine, or specifically like to the history of military medicine?
Well, I came to it from military history. So by training, I'm a military historian. And I was doing my master's on the campaign of 1809 in Austria. And I found a document in the archives in Vienna. And it was a little book published, which was the diary of an Austrian officer. Who, at the Battle of Ebelsberg on the 5th of May, 1809, took a bullet to the chest and survived, oddly. And he writes in his diary day by day the 4 years it took him to recover from that and the multiple operations he had to go through. And so I was like, oh, this is fascinating. Then I realized there was almost nothing on the topic, and I was looking for a PhD subject, so I had one. I did also try to read some medical memoirs from the time when I was 14 because I was a weird child, but that was not very successful because I did not understand any of it.
Yeah, I'm sure they can be a little dense for someone who's not medically trained to be reading medical specific memoirs.
Yeah. And even so for someone who's medically trained today, because the vocabulary and the whole, scientific representation of medicine has changed quite a bit since 19th century. So yeah, it can be a bit mysterious, but it's also fun in my opinion, at least.
Yeah, it must be very interesting to have like a person like writing about like their day to day of like, this is how my recovery is going. This is how I feel. This is what the doctors did. Like all of that, to have like a firsthand account, not just a doctor being like, I'm great. He died, but I'm great. I did everything I could, which I feel like is a lot of them. Being like, God, I did 100% the right thing by draining him of all of his blood, but somehow he died. But to have like the patient's point of view and be like, I felt like shit.
Yeah. It's the only document like that I found in terms of a diary. I found a few memoirs that had similar things. But his diary was very, very interesting. And in particular, the repeated operations, because there were small bits of bones left in his wound. And it took years for them to fish all of them. So, it would get operated again and again and again, obviously without anesthetic, because there's no anesthesia at the time. And a lot of the time he's the one requesting the operation because he can't live his life. And in the middle of all those operation, he's going hunting with his friends, and then he gets sick again, has a few operations, and then goes back and everything. So that's kind of an interesting account. So that guy survived.
Very
eventually,
interesting.
and even made a recovery and went back to being an officer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay. I definitely wouldn't have thought you'd be well enough to go back to work, especially as an officer after that.
Yeah, it was kind of surprising, but he did. I mean, the amount of people who survived and made some amount of recovery is always a little bit surprising when you see the intensity of some of the injuries. And yeah, I mean, a lot of them obviously die, but some do recover that I would not have expected them to, I have to say.
Yeah. So, yeah, we had a skeleton at university who'd taken a sword to the face and then survived and then apparently went back to the war because he then was in the mass burial pit with all the other guys. And I'm like, dude, you took a sword to the face and lived. Maybe you should have just walked home, like not gone back to war.
I mean, you'd get the list of injuries. I have a few, not many, because those are documents that did not often survive. But you have the time when like some soldiers leave war because of disability, and you have the list of all the injuries they have sustained, and the doctors explaining why they can't fight anymore. And some of those lists are unconscionably long. You know, it's like this is quite a few things that happen to them. Yeah.
You're like, your luck is going to run out at some point. Please stop.
Eventually, yeah. Yeah,
So
definitely.
For anyone who doesn't know, myself included, I'm a little guilty of this. Can you give us an introduction into the Napoleonic Wars? Just a brief overview, perhaps, of what sort of period we're in time.
Of course. Yeah, so we're in the early 19th century. So from the French Revolution, so 1789, the start of the French Revolution, and then you have a series of war from 1792 up to 1815. And from 1800, Napoleon's in power in France, and from 1804, he's the emperor. So, and then you have a variety of wars of France against most of Europe. France gets allies mostly in Germany, Italy, and Poland. But there's also, coalitions against France of different countries. And the first sort of half of that is mostly French conquering Europe until 1808, 1809. With 1808, you have the war in Spain that starts putting a bit of a dent into Napoleon's conquest of Europe, because the Spanish people fight in guerrilla warfare. And then you've got, the attempt of Napoleon to invade Russia that famously does not go well. And there's a retreat in which a very, very large proportion of the army does not come back. And eventually Napoleon is defeated quite majorly in Leipzig in 1813, which is the biggest battle in the history of Europe before World War I, which is a little bit forgotten, at least in France. And then, he comes back in 1815 and is defeated again in Waterloo, and then goes to die in St. Helena. So, yeah. I don't know if that's...
No, that's perfect. That's great. So what sort of, I guess, stage of medicine are we in this period as well, especially in France and the areas that the Napoleonic Wars are going on? Like, what kind of level of medicine are we at?
Yeah, of course. So a few data is probably important for what we're talking about is that it's pre-anesthesia, obviously, and pre-asepsis. It's a moment in medicine where the main way that people understand the human body are shifting, are a little bit unstable. The humor theory is kind of forgotten. There's a bunch of debates between mechanism and vitalism on how the human bodies work. There's a lot of attempts to innovate in the way medicine practiced. There's a whole question of observing patients in a clinic setting. It's been, studied by Michel Foucault quite famously. So some things are starting to shift in terms of how we understand the human body, but the main discoveries and modifications in how medicine is actually practiced are a bit later in the century, so in the 1840s and 50s. So we're very much in a surgery, like Peter Stanley talks about the story at the time, saying it's bloody, dangerous, and horrible or something. The quote is probably not quite precise, but it's that general idea. Which doesn't mean that the people are not skilled, but there are limitations, in particular due to the absence of anesthetic, which does limit the possibility to have long and complex operations because, the patient is moving. So,
yeah, I recall seeing a dramatized series a few years back it was Victorian London, but it was following a surgeon, and I remember them like timing how quickly he could like amputate someone's leg because they weren't unconscious. So it was like surgeons had like competitions as to like how fast can you do this surgery, and it was kind of like there's a person dying there maybe, but yeah, I guess speed is their main thing.
That is partly a myth. So there was, if you don't mind me, there was an idea to try to do it as quickly as possible to limit the amount of pain, the person was in. But and in particular, I'm going to talk a lot about a guy called Dominique Jean Larrey because he was the head surgeon of first the Imperial Guard and then the Grande Armée, so the army of Napoleon. And also he wrote a lot and was very good at self-publicity. So we have and he stole a bunch of documents. So we have a lot of documents from him as a result. And he definitely talked a lot about how quickly he could operate, but also how quickly has been exaggerated because it does not it only takes into account the cutting part and not all the ligature and tying stuff back together, which is what takes the longest. So when they tell you, it took 3 minutes, that's just the cutting part. And the estimation is between 15 and 20 minutes, which is still, quite fast to cut a leg off. But it's must be quite long for someone who is being operated on in that particular, situation.
Yeah, I can't imagine laying there and watching them cut off my leg.
Yeah, me neither.
So you've mentioned a few sources there and a few individuals. So is how you've gone about your research, is it mostly literature based?
It's a mix of archives, like testimony, so a lot of memoirs, diaries, letters, that sort of things. There's some listings. I've done a bit of quantitative stuff and statistics and things like that, from hospital listings and, rolls to have the death tolls and things like that. And then a tiny bit of archaeological sources, but sadly they got published a little bit after I was done. And then medical sources. So medical thesis and reports, inspections, things like that. So it's a bit of a wide variety. And of course, rules, regulations, laws about the medical, because there's a military health services that work. So I've worked on the French and Austrian armies, and they both have, military health services that has their rules and regulations. So I've also worked with those documents.
Okay, wow. I hadn't really thought about the military law surrounding medicine.
Yeah, because they have to manage the interaction with the military, obviously, and they have a bit of a complicated status. We can get into that, but it might be a bit not quite the subject of this podcast, but there's quite a lot of conflict between, the doctors and the administrators and things like that.
I feel like that's a case throughout all of time, doctors versus administrators.
Yeah.
So can you talk a bit, maybe, about what the typical experience of a wounded soldier on the battlefield or during the Napoleonic Wars would be like? Did they have battlefield hospitals? Were they in tents? What level maybe of treatment were they kind of getting?
Yeah. I'm going to try to make it short. I did write a whole book on that question. So I'll do my best. I'll try not to talk for too long.
If anyone wants the full thing, they can read the full book.
Yes, in French, which Good luck. But yeah, so basically on the battlefield itself, the idea is during the battle, theoretically, not much happens. In practice, although it's forbidden, soldiers bring their comrades away from the battlefield. And so you have like first aid points, which are a bit away from the battlefield. In theory, away from artillery fire. It's a little bit theoretical because it's hard to know where the artillery fire will be. Obviously. So they end up being taken there to those first aid points, which can be anything from a barn to a tree because there's a bit of shade to a castle they got. And it can be anything from just one doctor to a full-on like small hospital. The distinction between those first aid points and the first hospitals, which are supposed to be one day away, can be a little bit blurry sometimes. And then if you're an officer, especially a high-ranking officer, you're probably going to get your own doctor. But for the rank and file, it's just going to be, in those barns. And then they describe, piles of limbs as amputations are done right there on the battlefields. And so you end up with piles of cut off limbs there. And on this very, early like first aid thing, which can be pretty quickly, can take a few days if you end up on the battlefield, and then local civilians or soldiers or sometimes the military musicians will go and pick up the wounded and bring them back. There's also a specialized corps in the Austrian army, and they try in the French army, but it doesn't work, that goes and pick up the wounded. And then, they get those first aid there, and then they're sent back a few days away in temporary hospitals, which are often very overcrowded, and that can be in the hospital they existed, in a church, in a big building, basically. And then they will get evacuated further away, back to the lines as time goes on, if they survive, obviously. And often, once they get better, they get put in civilian homes to avoid contagion. Once they're a little bit better and well enough to not need constant medical care, they end up in civilians' house. So obviously it avoids the contagions for the soldiers, but not for the civilians. And you end up having quite large epidemics in the civilian population because of that. So, yeah.
So,
and on the sorry, please go ahead.
No, go on.
No, I meant on the battlefield itself. They would do anything from just, wrapping up wounds to complex operations, amputations. And it can be like several hundreds in a day, depending on the size of the battle. So it can end up being late at night by the light of a candle with limited available, personnel to do that. So, yeah.
I was just going to ask, was there any kind of rules around like how many medical personnel you're supposed to have to like how many soldiers? Like, is there any kind of ratio system going on?
Yes, there absolutely is. I do not have it in my head right now. I can look because I know where it is, so I can look. But yes, there absolutely is a ratio. The problem with that is that, first of all, well, it's hard to recruit enough people to have that ratio full because, training medical professionals takes time. There's also a bunch of reasons why it's particularly difficult for the French, because they fired most of their medical officers in 1803, and then when they briefly had peace, and then they didn't want to come back. So that was a bit of an issue. And the Austrians had a very high standard of training their medical officers, which means it was really hard to find people that would have gone through that training. Because basically you have military health services that were built in the 18th century for wars that were a lot smaller than the Napoleonic Wars. And so the system is not a bad system necessarily, but it's not made for the type of war that they're fighting, which is a bit of an issue. And the other problem with that ratio is that those wars Napoleonic Wars move very quickly. And when you end up with wounded and sick soldiers, you can't move because they are too sick. You have to leave a doctor with them. And so as the campaign progresses, there's less and less doctors each time because, they have to stay, and also because they die from contagion and illnesses mostly. So yes, there's a ratio. It's a little bit theoretical.
The ratio kind of starts to fall apart the longer into the battle you get, I suppose.
Yeah.
Makes sense. So how advanced maybe was the level of care that they would have been offering? So you're saying like there's amputations and stuff like that. Is it a situation of like they can only do the bare minimum, or can they maybe try stuff that's a little more advanced, or do they try and like move you on to a better hospital if you need more treatment?
They tend to try to do as much. That's one of the things that changes during the period, actually, that they try to do more and more directly there because they realize that the transport conditions are very bad. And so if someone has a broken limb, for example, they're going to die probably on the way because the transport conditions mean that they won't get anything for a couple of days. There'll be a while before they get any medical attention again. So they can do something pretty complex sometimes. It basically depends. It's triage, right? They don't call it that yet, but it's kind of the beginning of triage, even if it's not formalized at this point. So they might sometimes do very complex things, in particular on how do you call that in English? Swords and bayonet wounds, that type of injuries, because they tend to be very complex, but not necessarily life-threatening, because you can sew something up. It takes the time, but there's a good chance that it's going to work. They generally don't try anything if somebody's wounded, in the belly region, in that area of the body, because there's just no point. It doesn't work. They don't. Before World War I, basically, that's a death sentence.
Wow.
But they will get bits of bullets out from the lungs, for example, because that sometimes works. Or from the head, and they will try things that can be pretty complex if they have the time and if the surgeon that is there is competent enough, because the level of competence of surgeons varies a lot, depending on if they actually did their studies or if they're just a first-year medical students that got drafted. Or a butcher, because that did happen on occasion.
I was gonna ask, is it like a military-led training for the medical personnel, like surgeons and stuff, or is it like them drafting fancy rich surgeons from who definitely didn't want to be in war, being like, well, you've got the skill set, so you're in now?
That's a bit of a mix. So there is a training for military surgeons specifically in Austria. They have their school and everything. In France, they have like trained surgeons that choose to go to the military sometimes. They also have medical students that they're going to draft because they reached, the age of the draft and are just sent into the medical services. So you've got a variety of trainings. And I mean, the Austrians also just draft medical students and whoever they can get their hands on. And also the Austrians use invalided, disabled soldiers and train them to become medics for the military. So that's their own particular way of filling the ranks, so to speak.
Ah, that's so interesting. So is that individuals who, because of their disability, wouldn't have been able to fight, but obviously they still need as many people as they can get, so they're like, you do medical stuff?
It's generally people who have already been soldiers and who have, are too old or who have been injured and can't be soldiers anymore. And they will send them, they call them Halbinvaliden, so half invalids. And they would be sent to do, not doctors, but sort of basic medics and, nurses, basically. That would also be done by these people.
That is so interesting. I had never realized that was a thing. That's so cool.
Yeah, I think it's pretty specific to the Austrians.
I like that though. Given you need the people. These people are still capable of doing some things. Maybe not fighting, but they're definitely still capable. Give them a job. That's so cool. So So is it kind of there's these different levels of medical professionals, and then obviously
Yes.
there's different hierarchies within the military as well. And you mentioned before how some people might have private doctors. So is the level of care you're receiving also kind of based off of your rank too?
To a point, yeah. Definitely. I mean, high-ranking officers will get better medical care. It also depends on how much money you have, because while you don't have to pay for the normal. If you want to pay your own civilian doctor that you hire, you need to have money, which is generally related to rank, but not always. You have lower-ranking people that have money and will pay someone to treat them. But yeah, basically, you will. It's not necessarily the level of the doctor itself, more how many people they're going to be treating. So if you're an officer, you will get a good one, but you mightn't get a good one even if you're a rank and file. But he will be treating 100 people instead of just you if you're a general. So there's definitely a differentiation by rank there.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's kind of you'd think it's kind of unfair as well, because you're all fighting. You should receive equal care.
Yeah. But there's actually propaganda about that. There's I can actually send you that. There's a painting called the Death of General Valubert. So he died at the Battle of Austerlitz. So 2nd of December 1805, near modern day Brno in the Czech Republic. Which
I used to live there.
Napoleon's. Yeah, and I'm going to live there next year.
It's great.
Anyway, so in that battle, that was Napoleon's big victory. He died, that general, and there's this painting that represents him refusing to get medical care, so and to be taken away from the battle to not distract his soldiers from their role. And that was a big propaganda thing in Napoleonic propaganda to show the example of not of not distracting other soldiers from the fight by asking to be brought back, because that was a whole thing, so to speak. Yeah.
I can imagine the propaganda behind the no, don't focus on me, keep on fighting.
Yeah.
Keep going. Yeah.
So there's a fair bit of propaganda.
Yeah.
Yeah. No.
Are there any sort of innovations in medical practices that we're seeing as well? I can imagine that in a triage situation, people kind of come up with crazy things to solve a problem.
So there's not a lot of innovations in terms of techniques. There's a few things in the specifics of how to operate in an amputation, which is mostly realizing that some innovations from the 18th century were a bad idea. There's some minor innovation, but it's mostly sort of giving up on the very complex bandaging with a lot of different stuff put in it to just use water and make it quick. And it's mostly realizing that it is better to operate quickly. Because there's a lot of debate on the 18th century as to when to operate, whether you should wait for infection to have set in, basically, which they call the accidents at the time. Because basically infection is not avoidable, right? There's no asepsia. So infection will happen. And the whole point is to make it of as good a character as possible, is the word they use. So the question is, should you operate before the infection sets in or after? And they realize that it's better to do it as quickly as possible. That's one of the main innovations. And there's the few experiments in terms of actually having ambulances, horse drawn, but actually going into the battlefield to pick up people. It's not widespread, but there's a few elite corps in which that starts being the norm. So it's more organizational than actually medical in terms of innovations.
Yeah, that's very interesting, though. So do they know at this time what an infection is, what's causing it, or do they just see the result of infection and know it's a bad thing?
Well, they don't know that microbes exist, right? Because that's Pasteur, that's much later. They do have a conception of, of a wound getting infected, of producing pus. They have various theories to explain it that are a bit of a mix of the person's specific conditions and in terms of what type of body they have, what type of temperament and all of that, and the physical conditions they find themselves in. They do have a conception of contagion. But yeah, it's a time where the scientific basis of understanding why that's the case is a little bit unsure, because humors are sort of out. There's still references to it, but it's not the theory doesn't hold anymore. But there isn't one to replace it yet. So there's a mix of different explanations that are clearly trying to figure this stuff out at that point. I mean, it's actually quite interesting to see them offer explanations and things like that. Yeah, and trying to square the idea that wounds from Hippocratic medicine, that health depends largely on the individual, characteristic of a person, and the fact that they're dealing with mass casualty events, as we would say today, with large epidemics. So those two things, which have always have been a problem for a very long time, but they're thinking about that in new ways at that. This is a bit less my specialty, I have to say, so I'm not 100% sure of what I'm saying, but yeah.
No, it was just more just to get an understanding of kind of what their idea of what's going on is at the time as well. So you mentioned when you reached out to me as well that there's something about death premonitions, you were saying, in some of these memoirs as well. So what is that?
So, well, I'll go describe them first, and then I have a theory about it, and you can, because I think you're an anthropologist, right? So you might tell me from what I'm saying. Archaeologist, if what I'm saying makes any sense at all. But basically, so you have a lot of example in memoirs of people having moments where they realize they are going to die before that happens. It can be anything from a musician being unable to make any music a few seconds before a bullet takes his head off. Or somebody saying to their friend, I know I am going to die tomorrow. Can you give that letter to my wife? And there's a lot of those examples. And the one thing they have in common, as far as I could tell, is that it's cases where the people died suddenly and alone. And a lot of the time it's like bodies were found afterwards, often without any clothes, things like that. So the way I read it, because it's something that's written 30 years after the fact, that it's a way to sort of repair the fact that death could not be prepared and was a bad death, right? A sudden death on your own, by sort of retroactively preparing that death in the narrative. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's sort of how I'm interpreting it in terms of narrative construction.
I think that makes sense. I feel like that is something you see even in like fictional literature, or like in loads of different kind of cases where they're talking about death, that there are different motifs of like preparing the individual like for specifically for sudden deaths as well. It's definitely something I've like read about before or seen about before in like memoirs and even fiction and different types of literature, that like if a sudden death is coming, that there are like the little preparations beforehand. Yeah, little signs beforehand, or like the individual themselves as like a dread moment kind of thing, that like something's coming.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
And also a lot of the time it's kind of interesting because the people who write the memoirs, right, who's the one who survived, obviously, tries to convince the person they're talking to that it's not true, that it's not going to happen, because it's also a time where there's the idea that like ideas have an effect on your body, right? It's a time in which you can die of sadness. So believing that you're going to die is dangerous. Like believing that you're going to die might get you killed. So it's also that
Yeah, so
that
it's
sort of framework.
yeah, so kind of like
Yeah.
like book up, like no, you're fine, everything's gonna be fine. Have a
Yeah.
positive mindset.
Yeah.
It's interesting. So, do these death premonitions or these sort of literary tropes that pop up, how do they play into sort of the military way as well? Like, are these individuals also like individuals who are on the battlefield that
Yes.
are being written about and they're in there as well? Yeah.
It's basically it's officers. I can give you an example if you want. I just have to find it, but it might be worth like not being in the complete theoretical. Then that's the other stuff. Oh yeah. So, for example, there's about Poniatowski, who was a Polish general who became a French marshal and who died in 1813. It's basically just he talks about the future with sadness, as if he was going to, if he knew that he was going to die, and also that Poland was going to die because Poland got lost its independence after the Napoleonic Wars. So it's things like that, but there's also longer stories where you have whole stories of explaining that a colonel who talks about his friend and say, oh, I was walking with my friend and then we stopped and his pistol took, he shot his pistol by mistake and he was absolutely sure that it meant he was going to die. And we all tried to tell him that that wasn't true, but he wouldn't be persuaded. And so he wrote a letter to his mistress and that I would have to give to her. And then he died the next day and we found his body, naked on the battlefield. And there's these types of stories. And it's generally amongst mostly officers because they write their memoirs a lot more, having these types of conversations. Yeah. And also because
I like how
a lot of the times it's like soldiers that will announce the death of their comrades directly to the family, right? Because there's a system of also from rank and file, but everywhere, like all the way up the military chains of bed comrades, where two soldiers are going to share the same bed. And organize their lives, so to speak, and be there in case one gets killed to warn the family of what happened. So you have these type of links that make these things work because there is official paperwork that's supposed to be sent back to the families, but it doesn't work very well. And so it's very much, inside the military friendships that happens.
A kind of like if you die, I'll tell your family. If I die, tell my family kind of deal between
that type of thing.
Friends
Yeah.
and stuff. Interesting. I also like how that guy was like, I've written a letter to my mistress, send it to her. My wife's fine. Don't worry about her.
That particular guy was not married, to be fair to him, because he was in the Order of Malta, so he was not allowed to be married. So yeah.
That makes sense then. So you're saying like that in these situations, like a lot of these individuals like die alone on the battlefields and then are found naked. Is that a real thing? Like they really would have been found naked then?
Yeah, I mean, people did steal effects on the battlefield pretty often. Or even from the wounded. There's text from one wounded man who is very surprised that he still has everything after having been found unconscious in the battlefield and brought back to hospital. And he still has all his money. And he is very, very surprised by that fact and quite happy. Definitely, taking stuff away from the dead. I mean, the weapons they are going to take away anyway, but often other things too. Fully naked doesn't happen that often, but it does. And the guy I started with, so this Austrian guy that took a bullet to the chest. So he was Austrian, and some Italian soldier stole his clothes, his boots in particular, because boots are expensive, especially an officer's boot, while he was on the battlefield because they thought he was dead. And so he punches them in the face and they run away. And eventually someone brings him to hospital a few hours later.
Nice. So are there any kind of misconceptions about battlefield medicine or treatment and stuff that people still believe today that just aren't true?
There's a few. There's the idea that there's no care at all, which is sometimes like basically that they're just left to die, or that the surgeons are unfeeling butchers. That's not true. They're people trying to do what they can in very difficult situations. I'm not saying like some of them were not bad people, but just the general perception of surgeons as butchers doesn't fit with the evidence. There's some rumors even at the time that surgeons would kill wounded soldiers and everything, but they don't seem to be substantiated. And yeah, I mean, it mostly feels like with Napoleon Wars in general, you always have the golden legend and the very dark legend. And the golden legend is mostly French, so I don't think it's likely to happen much in the English-speaking world, but of being like, it's all, everything is as it is in the regulations, very well organized, and it's beautiful and it's glorious and everything. And then you've got the dark legend, which is like Napoleon murdered his troops and there was no care at all, and they just were left to die. And the reality is that's often somewhere in between, where you had systems that were very much insufficient for the type of war that was being waged, but there were systems that did exist, and hospitals and evacuations and things like that.
I can imagine that propaganda from both sides sort of plays a factor in skewing the narrative of like what was going on, and that the reality
it's one of the hardest thing about one of the very hard things about working in Napoleonic Wars is that there's so much propaganda. The Napoleonic propaganda was all like, Napoleon was quite good at controlling the press, and on the other side in particular, the British propaganda had a lot of has had a lot of staying power, because there's a lot of caricature that is still like somewhere in the collective imagination to this day. So it is an interesting thing to work on that period, and also because the sources at the time like refer to the propaganda, work with it, interact with it, and it's always very hard to figure out what is what. But it's also what makes it fun. So I'm not complaining.
Yeah, because it's one of those things, like, obviously there was probably propagandas after the war, but then there's propaganda during the war, so people are actually like experiencing it in real time, like with the reality of the situations that they're living in as well.
Yeah, very much so.
Interesting. Okay. So is there anything that I haven't touched on or I haven't asked yet that you feel is important for the listeners to know, or that you find really interesting and you want people to know?
Yeah, there's probably one thing that I think is important is the fact that you have civilians and people that are some variety between coerced and volunteering to help wounded soldiers every step of the way, basically. Like the military health systems does not work without the civilian population, and that's like on the battlefield, that's picking up the wounded, burying the dead, that's in hospitals. A lot of the hospitals are civilian hospitals that are being requisitioned, or just getting food. Then people that are being housed in civilian housing, evacuation, which is done with civilian carts, and people are being fed by the civilian population at each nightly stop. So that's really very important in terms of how this works. And it just doesn't make sense without it. And maybe one last thing, because of the theme of the podcast, all of the regulations to make sure you don't bury people alive, but I'm sure you've talked about this in other.
I had not thought about that, actually. I want to know all the rules now. What are all the rules of how not to bury someone alive?
There's quite a few rules of like not taking people to the morgue until after for at least a day, unless they're the way they look is particularly offensive for the rest of the people, and you have to have a physician that actually checks that the person is dead. And you do not put something on someone's face before, like for a while, because if they wake up and they are like under, something that's for the dead, that's horrible. So you've got a lot of rules around that to make sure that you do not bury people alive or treat alive people like they were dead. So that's kind of interesting, because the ways of checking if someone's alive, are not always reliable at that time, especially when there's a lot going on. So
I had not thought about that at all.
Well, later in the century, you have the bells in the bells in the coffins in the Victorian times. So that's this whole.
That makes sense. They were a bit iffy about whether people were alive or dead, which you feel like should be the basic step of being a doctor. Step 1, is your patient still alive?
But that's tricky. It was like comas and stuff like that. That's,
True.
And,
just because they're not...
moving or breathing is hard to detect sometimes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, and there's been a lot of archaeological digs in the past few years, so that might be more interesting to you to know that has happened.
That is interesting. I'll have to
notably in Deutsch-Wagram, because the Austrian, like the city of Vienna or the Austrian government, I don't know, decided to do a new motorway. That might be the wrong dialect of English, but anyway. They didn't. I mean, obviously, they didn't check the maps of the Battle of Wagram, and they put the motorway right in the most intense phases of combat. So they found skeletons absolutely everywhere. So they had to stop and have an archaeological dig, which was a big delay for the motorway, and very great for me.
I was going to ask, is that you mentioned in the beginning that the archaeological some of the reports didn't come out until you were finished. So is that something you're interested in looking at how your archival research compares to the physical archaeology?
Yeah, it's super interesting. I mean, I don't quite have the problem with, archaeological reports is that they're really hard to read when you're not an archaeologist.
Yeah.
Especially when they're in German. But yeah, I mean, something that was really fascinating is that the level of fatigue injuries, fatigue fractures on those was like in the 90% type. Just they all had them. All of the infantry, basically. And the amount of signs of malnutrition in childhood, and it gave a lot of information, more of the general state of health of the population, and what war did to those bodies. So that was very interesting. And you did find signs of operations and things like that on some of those bodies, and so that was quite interesting to read. But yeah, it's sometimes a little bit hard to know what to do with it as a historian. And I do always... You would probably have a far better idea of what to do with it.
I do always find it interesting, how our two different groups, historians and archaeologists, could be studying the same things, but we just haven't found ways sometimes. Yeah, talk to each other and blend the information and be I can help you in this way and you can help me in this way. Thank you.
Yeah. And we've tried. I've been in a book was there's a collective volume we did with some archaeologists, and it was quite interesting. It hasn't been there hasn't been major contradictions, which is nice. To be okay, we are what we are saying is not completely flying over the moon. It actually makes sense. So that's always really nice. And I mean, historians and archaeologists have talked in the sense that the archaeologists have asked historians of okay, why is there a bunch of corpses here? But I mean, they know how to do that themselves, but talking to each other. But yeah, and also it's always kind of useful to see like what weapons actually do to bodies. And I have a few pictures of skeletons in my book that were graciously given to me by the archaeologists in Deutschwagam. So that was nice.
So I just wanted to circle back around. You were mentioning before about civilians being involved. Just
Yes.
dawned on me there. Are those civilians like French and Austrian civilians, or would you be like having civilians involved who are like from an area you've just taken over, or are they your own civilians that are helping out and like
they're not your own
soldiers?
They're basically the civilians of wherever you're fighting.
Okay.
So from what I'm looking at, it's Central Europe basically. So it's Austrians, Czechs, Hungarians, Germans mostly. There's the Napoleonic Wars. There's this combat in most of Europe, in the Americas. There's a few things going on in India. Like it's quite large. But for what I'm looking at, it's in Central Europe. Because there's only that many languages I can speak. But yeah, I've mostly worked on Central Europe. I mean, Ireland in 1798. There's a few different,
So then would those civilians, like, would they occasionally be antagonistic towards the soldiers as well? Because I presume, you've invaded their lands and started wars there. Like,
yes,
they probably don't want to be housing your sick.
No. So basically, there's a variety. Also, is this different where you have an insurrection and when you don't? So in Spain, in southern Italy, in Haiti, you had massive insurrections. Well, revolution in Haiti, actually. And in those circumstances, you would have, civilians massacring soldiers wounded soldiers because, the soldiers had burned their village and killed everyone. So that's a specific context. It's not the context I'm working on, where you do have some forms of violence every once in a while, but it's not that common. There's a lot of hostility, but it does seem that's actually what I'm working on at the moment. So it's a little bit less finished. But there does seem to be like an impulse towards charity that does exist. And the idea that, the wounded are not quite the enemy anymore is taking form. And although you do have forms of violence and the level of volunteering is clearly variable, you do have, for example, there's this guy, Chevillier, who gets his hand taken off, his arm taken off by a cannonball, a battle Wagram. And he gets, he gets to that first aid point, and it's somebody's house. And the farmer sort of takes the arm and goes to bury it under his apple tree, and to be like, oh, well, you're done fighting the Austrians now, but sort of in a very compassionate way, right? To be like, oh. So it's kind of complicated. A lot of the time it feels like war is seen more as almost like a natural catastrophe than really something you can do anything about. So the hostility is there. It's there, and it gets higher during the time period. By 1813, it's there. But a lot of the time, and also because, soldiers commit horrible acts of violence and sexual violence fairly frequently. But it's more complex than just we hate you. There's definitely a wide variety of attitudes, including, soldiers who get married with local women. It's not a very good answer because it's not yes or no, but there's a variety of reactions.
It's the right answer, though, that it is nuanced and, depends on the individual. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, which is, that's life.
For example, in Dresden in 1813, there's a lot of French soldiers who have self-mutilated to avoid going to war, and who are being treated. So they've basically shot through their hands. They've so that they can't serve, right? And they're being taken care of in civilian homes. And they're being inspected by some civilian administrator that's reporting to the French army. I love that document, by the way. It's great. And the administrators is complaining about the fact that the French soldiers are not receiving enough medical care. So, it's a complicated situation, basically. And I'm hoping to work more on that in the future to try and understand basically humanitarianism before the Red Cross. How do we get to that? Because there's definitely some things happening at that time that are going in that direction.
Yeah, it does sound like the beginning of a lot of the stuff that we would maybe recognize now in military medicine, and also just medicine in general. When you mention like they've got horse and buggy style ambulances going on as well.
They start, and some attempts to make ambulances neutral that fail, but to make that recognized. There's some things going on at that time that are quite interesting, even if they fail at that moment. But
at least there's obviously some sort of like effort being put in to make medicine, more medical treatment, more neutral and less like sided. It seems.
Yeah, I mean, taking care of the wounded of the enemy was the norm, right? You were supposed to take care, not equally. The idea is that you treat your own first, but you still treat those of your enemies as much as possible, basically. But I mean, doctors could be taken prisoner. Basically, if a doctor was taken prisoner, which happened, it would just be put to work to treat the wounded of the people that took them prisoner. And you read that in the doctor's like accounts, and it's barely a blip because they're just continuing to do the same job. Doesn't change it. It doesn't change
same job,
much.
Different administration structure. That's it.
Yeah. So yeah. All right.
It's been very interesting. So if anyone wants to learn more or to read your book, where can they? What's the name of your book?
So the name is Les Blessés de Napoléon, and it's been published with Passé Composé. It is in French, so that might be a bit of a limit for most people. I have a few articles in English, but yeah, that I can send you if you want. But yeah, it's my book is in French.
Well, I'll have everything linked in the show notes in the description. So if anyone does want to follow up, they can find it all there. Thank you so much for agreeing to be on. This has been very fascinating and I've learned so much. I now need to go do little mini tangent researches on different things because I've been inspired now.
Please don't hesitate if you want, references and stuff like that. I'm more than happy to send you things. If you need the sources I mentioned, basically you can just ask. That's fine.
Perfect.
Yeah, and thank you so much for inviting me because that's been great. And I'm very happy to have been able to talk about my research.
Yes. So thank you to the listeners as well for being here. And I will see you next week.
Thanks.
Bye, guys.